Welcome to the Liberty Alert with Gregory Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C., a program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking two-kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C., and friends of the program all around the country. I'm Gregory Seltz. Welcome to the Liberty Alert, where every week we try to cut through the noise and take on the issues, especially the public issues that matter to people of faith. You know, we try to rely on the wisdom of the Word for the sake of the culture and the mission of the church. Or as we like to say at the LCRL, we're trying to put our temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of God for all. Today, Christians in the Chaos, Part 2. And, you know, again, things are coming at us fast and furious here in Washington, D.C. You know, one of the things that I think has been really tough about this new position that I've been doing the last several years is, you know, I'm used to looking at legislation, looking at what's coming out of D.C., trying to figure out how does that help or hurt the church. Or, you know, we do the same thing in the ministries in our cities when we're working in the cities of our particular choice. But now with these regulatory agencies, I mean, overnight they can change guidelines, and the next thing you know, your church is scrambling. Your schools, your preschools are scrambling to make sure they're in compliance. And when you start hearing words like compliance, that doesn't sound American. You know, that's exactly the opposite of the freedom to do what is right for the sake of others. You know, I don't have any problem with agencies regulating to make sure things are clean and proper and safe and all these kind of things. But we're now starting to see these regulatory agencies redefine issues of conscience literally overnight. And then suddenly law-abiding citizens become criminals just by virtue of having different conscience perspective on these issues. And so, you know, this is happening, folks, and this is happening at a very, very quick rate in our culture. And we need to get up to speed on this. Truth is being redefined as lies and deception. So things that we held in common, and I'm talking about common, all races, all individuals, even people of different religions held a lot of these truths in common. Now those are being redefined by the libertine, what I call secular pietists in our midst. But the worst thing is, okay, it's one thing to have something redefined. It's another thing to then say, and now we'll use the coercive power of the government to force you to believe or to say it this way. Wow. You know, one of the things we try to teach, you know, again, this program, one of the things we're trying to do is give people skill sets or a way of thinking through these things so that we can depoliticize these things. We're not the ones making these things political. We're the ones pushing back and saying that's not something that the federal or even the local government should dictate to people. It should be the other way around. They have to answer to us. And the government right now is being reclassified right before our eyes from being referees who create, you know, the laws that we all got to play by, the rules that we all have to play by that are fair, to people who actually are saying this is how you are going to play the game. And you're going to play that game the way we tell you, or you're going to be taken out of the game altogether. And so Christians, again, we've still got to stand for truth, I would say, and a healthy individualism where you take personal responsibility and you don't look to other people to actually do for you what you're supposed to do for yourself, for those you love, and for your community. And then all in a spirit of freedom, humility, civility, and of course always tempered with the repentance and grace that finally makes all of life worth living. So, you know, thanks again for tuning in today. Again, our culture, in many ways, it seems like it's hell-bent on committing moral suicide, and the evidence is mounting again, and the weaponization of the politics of the issues of conscience, it's mounting. And, with some of the legislation I've been watching, and we'll be talking about in the days to come, basic pro-life protections, even things like the Hyde Act, that virtually every Democrat and every Republican voted for at the time that it was passed. These things are being wiped out. There's conscience protections in states. I'm speaking around the country this month a lot, and a lot of the folks are saying things like, well, we have state protections, and we've already done that kind of stuff, protecting our state in the legislature, and we're running for school boards, and we're doing that. And I'm saying, well, you don't understand. This federal government is very monarchical, and it's trying to put federal laws into place that will wipe out all of your state protections, all of your local protections, and of course, all of your local autonomy. And that's an anti-American spirit, if I've ever heard one. The last president was they constantly called him a fascist. They were constantly, and words almost have no meaning today. Because a fascist is someone who takes away your rights and literally dictates to you from the government's point of view what you will do and what you will be. And if you don't comply, then you will be in huge trouble. Well, even the executive orders of the last president, when you look at what he was actually doing, he was taking away regulations and giving people back the authority to deal with their own lives, run their own businesses. That's the most anti-fascist thing you can do, is give people back their responsibility and opportunity. Well, when you look at some of the things that are happening now, it's the exact opposite spirit. It's monarchical, and if you want to use the word fascist, it's more in line with that, because people's rights are literally being taken away. Conscience rights are being stripped, protections are being stripped away by either government fiat or by regulatory agencies now that are going to punish you for noncompliance. Again, that's the kind of stuff we're pushing back on, that because we want our churches, our schools, our preschools to be able to be Christian in their service. And there is a movement afoot that is going to use every trick possible to say, well, you can participate, but you can't be Christian. So again, remember we used to always talk about, don't make a federal case out of every disagreement. Well, again today, it's like every issue is federalized. And then we also were telling the government, quit taking sides on a lot of these conscience issues. Whenever I'm speaking to people, I always say, I'll give you an example, one that I don't think is very political today, just as an illustration. Back in the 70s, they decided overnight there was a gas crisis. I don't know if anybody remembers this. I do. I was in my teens, but I still remember this. I remember, and I think it was Nixon who did this. So again, I'm not being bipartisan. I'm just saying here's bad law. The first thing he did, I think, in hyperinflation, he tried to fix prices. He just tried to say, and I think we're going to have some of that too, with the government spending all this money. Whenever you print twice as much money as you actually have, it gives you half as much power with that dollar. That dollar suddenly doesn't go as far. It doesn't buy as much. It's one of the ways that the poor are always getting kicked in the teeth by the government, because the government promises them goodies, but then it increases the cost of those goodies. So even if I give you more money, but I double the price of things, if gas goes through the roof, if goods go through the roof, suddenly the money I gave you is no better than what you had before. And people don't understand this. They think, oh, good, they're going to give us universal income. They're going to give us a check every quarter or something. Well, but they're driving up the cost of things by inflating it. Well, Nixon was one of those guys who said, well, then let's just decide what the price is going to be. And he fixed the prices of lots of stuff around the country. Well, all that did was made it impossible for people to actually survive by producing those things. And then suddenly there wasn't any food on the shelves, just like we saw with some of the supply chain stuff with COVID. And now we're even seeing with some of the problems in our own government policies. It's crazy stuff. But the one that got me the most was the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Overnight from the federal government, they decided, because they told us all there was a gas shortage, like we were running out of gas. And then we always get these fear-mongering things, and people go, what, we're running out of gas, we don't have any gas. It actually was just politics that was causing the supply chain problems, and we found out we even have 300 years more of gas right now that we've discovered in fracking and things like that. But back then they were scaring us half to death again, and there was no gas. You had to wait in gas lines and buy at different times. And overnight they said 55 miles an hour everywhere. Everywhere, literally everywhere. Now again, this goes to show how the federal government, its solutions are terrible for the particulars of a particular community, because all over the country there were some places where if you had to drive 55 miles an hour on these wide open roads that were straight as an arrow, it would take you forever to get where you had to go, and it wasn't dangerous at all to drive those roads faster than 55. Now, if you live in D.C. or New York or L.A., where the traffic is so bad that you can probably never get over 55, who cares, right? But in West Texas, from Dallas to El Paso, 55 feels like you're going backwards. And now with the fuel efficiency of cars, the safety features of cars, the roads are much safer. 55 is a ridiculous speed in West Texas or in the middle of Kansas. But overnight, every person who drove any faster than that was made a criminal, even though it was the reasonable speed limits were much higher in a lot of these places. That's how the federal government comes in and with a hammer. It makes everybody do the same thing, even when it makes no sense in the local communities. Now, over time, states have been taking back this, and communities have been taking back this and making the decisions for themselves. Speed limits are going up around the country in places. Some places still 55, others 65, some are 75, even some are 80 again, where it's appropriate. And so, again, like we've said before, government has a role in our lives. It's supposed to create fair laws for everybody, but our founding fathers understood the best way to rule is to rule ourselves and do that in community. And the last thing we needed was a monarch or a president who thought he was the king who's telling us all what to do. Well, we just got word yesterday, or whenever you're hearing this, it could be a couple of days from now, that parents who now are exercising their rights of saying we don't want critical race theory or identity politics or any of these kinds of things being taught in our curriculum, or the sexual orientation, gender identity stuff being taught in our curriculum, they're pushing back on this, and the president had his attorney general reclassify them as domestic terrorists, and they're going to be treated as such. Now, folks, this is the kind of stuff that should terrify people. People of all goodwill, of both sides of the aisle, should be saying, no, this is not the right way to do this. I mean, we just got through 2 years of real violence against protesters. I mean, if you're in D.C., I've seen this happen, where, all these protests that everyone said were legitimate protests, I've seen it become violent. I've seen them intimidate people. I've seen them chase down politicians. These are always leftist causes. I've seen them actually exercise mob control of things. Recently now, I guess one of the people who stood against the, I don't know if it was the DACA thing, someone followed her into the bathroom and then cornered her on the airplane and stuff like this because, obviously there was a disagreement with their policy. And I've seen protests in the Capitol that no one ever talked about on the national news that actually disrupted Congress, that actually got onto the Congress floor, but it was actually talked about as that was good. That was the exercising of democracy. Well, it's because it wasn't a conservative protest. It was a secular progressive protest. And, they even took over old capitals. Capitol buildings in states across the country. And they've taken over portions of business areas in cities across the country. Violence and looting and all these different things. None of that was a problem. And now parents at school boards voicing their concern. That's actually what you're supposed to do. And they're claiming that there's violence. I think, again, people, we got to see the evidence of this. Because I've seen a lot of these folks. I've read a lot of these folks. They're people saying, no, we don't want you teaching our children this. And they have a right and a responsibility to do that. And again, when I talk to people, say, well, then just run for the school board, et cetera. Yes, I agree with that too, but the reality is now the federal government is stepping in and it's intimidating one side of the argument. Wow. And just to give you an example of how bad this can get, there is I just read an article about, I can't remember now here if he was let me see, Thomas Caldwell. He was 65 years old. He spent 53 days in jail, 49 of them in solitary confinement. And what was his crime? Well, he was in Washington January 2nd. That was it. They were American flag wavers. They were there, to show their support, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on. Everyone has this right, has this even responsibility at times. And he's a 65-year-old veteran who also basically he's legally disabled, and they arrested him and said he was the mastermind of January 6th. And that he was in the Capitol and he was leading the charge and all these different things. They arrested him, never charged him. He was in 53 days in jail, 49 days in solitary, and he was dragged out of his house by the FBI at gunpoint. And now he's out. He finally got out, and they're finding out that everything they accused him of, none of it's true. He and his wife were just in D.C., outside. That should scare people. He's a U.S. citizen. He's a veteran. And he was 49 days in solitary confinement. And all they had to do was create a narrative around his life, and they put him away. Now, I don't know how he got out. His wife thought he was going to die because she thought he'd be back the next day because she knew it had to be a mistake. I mean, they were just outside watching all this stuff happen. And he never came back. And then she thought, I wonder if he died. And she heard nothing. The government doesn't have the right to do that. It does not have the right to do that. Look at the Bill of Rights. It's specifically designed to push back on the government's ability to just come in, take over, reclassify you, put a narrative around you, and then put you in a hole. That's not what they're supposed to be able to do. That's what the whole Miranda rights stuff was all about. That's why we have the fruit of the poison tree argument, where criminals go free, because the last thing we want to do is arrest an honest man and accuse him of something he didn't do. Well, here we go. And no one's even talking about this. So again, there's chaos today. There's Christians in the middle of this chaos. And I think the Bible, again, gives us two broad strokes. We've talked about this before. We have a salt and a light mentality. We're supposed to lay God's moral foundations while also offering a solution to this stuff that has nothing to do with government. And that's God's undeserved love and forgiveness. It's a both and thing. And so, again, the main question for all the stuff we're dealing with, it's not so much, especially in this left-hand kingdom stuff, it's not what do you think about even things like equality and equity and all that. It's what's the government's role in protecting us. What's their main role, and then limiting that role. And foundations are being destroyed. Moral truths are being reclassified. And that's why the cheering crowds of even like the New York legislature saying you can kill a baby no matter the term, even after it's born, that should chill us to the bone. And we should say, no, we can't let that happen in a civil society. It should also trouble us that family is being redefined and willfully being destroyed. Laws are willfully being broken. Criminals are willfully being set free. And citizens are willfully having their rights taken away. And again, that's what's happening. And that's the kind of thing where we should say, now, why are we allowing that to happen? And then what's our role as Christians for the sake of our society? So again, I think, and I've said this before, I think it's God's moral ordering that's being challenged. That's really what's happening in our culture today. So for those of you who are like, we shouldn't get political, et cetera, I agree with you. We shouldn't get political, but God's moral ordering needs to be proclaimed. And so whether you like it or not, people are calling that political. And it's God's moral ordering. He created us male and female, that we're now saying that we're rejecting that. Fidelity laws, the chaos of marriage, divorce, and illegitimacy and all those things. We're just violating clear commandments and clear moral ordering of God. We even have a politics of covetousness now, where people think that what we do with politics is we get ours, as if that's what politics is all about. And once those foundations, if they give way, then it's every man for themselves, or it's tribalism, and maybe that's where we're going to go with all this stuff. And again, we can be Christian in the middle of that, and we can still proclaim the good news of the gospel, but that's going to be a very terrifying world. I was talking to some people about this at a conference, and I said, I think what America is struggling with, I really believe that there's no universal polity or no universal principle that can ultimately hold all people together, because we're all broken, we're all sinful, we're all selfish, and we generally like our own. I mean, that's the human condition. And so if the Christian message is, if our principles could hold us together, if our principles could make all that stuff go away, then there wouldn't be a need for a Savior. So I know ultimately that principles and laws will not ultimately hold us together. They can keep all hell from breaking loose. They can curb our worst intentions, but something else is going to have to come in and hold us all together. America's the first culture that said, here's some principles that can hold us together better than most. Almost all other cultures are tribal in nature. You are you're a Nigerian, or you're a German, or you're a Swede, or something like that, because you're part of a tribe of people that kind of looks like that and talks like that. America came in and said, well, here's principles that pull all of those people together. And again, it just shows how our principles, even if they're good, still lack the ability to really hold. There's got to be something even bigger than that. Now, the Founding Fathers actually believe this. That's why they said the federal government shouldn't be the answer to a lot of things, because it won't hold us together. But if you were free and you were self-disciplined and you were religiously motivated, those kind of people could get along with each other. So again, just as a matter of course, what should we do in response? Let me just say again, Christians in the middle of the chaos, we are not afraid of the chaos, okay? If anything, we should be the kind of people in the middle of it saying, it can get better than this. It can get a lot worse than this. But there's a message of grace, hope, and peace no matter what is happening in the world. And we have all of that we can say to people. We have all of that. I often talk about the fact that no matter what's going on in culture, Christians can be in the middle of that for the sake of the culture, as well as for the sake of the mission of sharing the good news of the gospel to anyone who will listen. But the first thing we have to do is we have to assert the truth anew. God is at work in the world to preserve and save, and we know that even if our principles of our polity, which is what government is, even those things, even if they're good, they can't save us, but they can curb our worst intentions, and that's what we should look for the government to do. We don't put our faith in government, but we want to put good law in place for all. So one of the things that we're going to be fighting, because I just think this is the temptation in America at the moment, is that there's this notion of political utopia that we can actually create with technology, money, and the like. We can create the perfect world. We don't need God because he was kind of a myth or a construct anyway. Well, I got bad news for you. You know, even Facebook, which was going to create the digital community and make us all one. Well, we find out that Facebook has all kinds of data that how it does things hurts people, and they don't care. Facebook actually does what's in Facebook's best interest, and that shouldn't surprise you because that's the human condition. And you know, even people who come from meager means, who make it all the way to the top and have all kinds of power, once they get in power, they don't want anyone to take it away from them. And that's how human beings are. And that's why our founding fathers said, we don't want a king, we want free individuals living in community with each other. Now, the second thing I think we've got to do, we've got to actually start defending the abused and punish the lawless ones. Because, you know, when you see somebody like a Thomas Caldwell, who literally, they made him a political prisoner. I kept thinking, this stuff happens in communist regimes. You know, this happens in banana republics when someone who speaks a political message you don't want suddenly is classified as an enemy of the state. When parents in school boards are now under investigation by the attorneys general and the FBI. No. We're weaponizing law enforcement against citizens. And, you know, I think we just have to speak out against that for the sake of the society in which we live. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing, and I've given the people that have been arrested in January 6th, I guess a lot of them are being held. I don't know that much about all this stuff, so this is not a political statement, okay? Even the people in Guantanamo Bay after 9/11, they were given pastoral care. And we've always talked about visiting anybody in prison, even people with whom we disagree. And I guess the January 6th people like this Thomas Caldwell, a lot of them are being held without being charged in solitary confinement, with no idea of why they're even in there, and they will not let pastors go in and care for these people at all. And I working with some people who are fighting for the civil rights of these folks, and they've asked me if I would be open to being a pastor who would go in and just provide pastoral care to people in prison. And I said, sure. So we'll see. I'm awaiting a phone call if they'll let me go in and talk with some of these people and just listen to them and pray with them and maybe even share the good news of the gospel with them. But it's interesting to me how this stuff is being reclassified in so many different ways. And our laws, our Constitution doesn't give the government this kind of authority. But in the age of COVID, the government feels like it can do as it pleases unless you can stop it. And it's crazy to think how we've flipped into that when citizens, you know, have a right to live their lives faithfully to their families and to their communities. And how that now is being threatened, or it's under siege. And even how, you know, worship. Again, we'll see if there's a second shutdown. And we're monitoring that because I think we've pushed back enough now on the COVID stuff where they realize you don't have the right to tell us how to worship or how to assemble or how to serve one another. We can assess the risks. We can live with the challenges that these things put upon us because every day is a challenge. Every day there's things that mitigate life, and every day we have to face those things. And the Christian message is faith, not fear. Now we're not talking about being foolish, because we do want to do what is right, but we're not going to have that done by dictation from above. We're going to have that done in freedom with each other. So in number 3, we got to proclaim God's ordering and creating of the world is a beautiful thing. And right now, it's being reclassified as hate speech. Bishop Pohjola in Finland and Minister Rosanen in Finland, for those of you who don't know, January 23rd, they are going to go on trial after, I think, a year and a half of being questioned and probed and all these things. And their crime is that they teach marriages between a man and a woman. And they teach biblical understanding of sexuality within the marriage bond. That's their crime. That should scare people again. That should chill us to the bone that a Western country is creating what we call secular blasphemy laws. And you will go to prison if you violate these blasphemy laws. And we'll see. I talked with people. We had the protest in front of the consulate. I spoke at that. I got a chance to talk to the communications director. I also talked to the consulate general over the phone. We voiced our concern about a free country like Finland to be this intolerant, and we were told, no, they're the most tolerant, one of the most tolerant nations in the world. We'll see. Because if you can put people on trial for having a biblical sense of morality and dignity, that to me is the exact opposite of the definition of tolerance. And then, of course, if we're going to talk about God's moral ordering of the world, this is something that is for the sake of all people. These are conscience issues, and God is the one who is the authoritative person over our conscience. So, now listen, if you do this, if you start to defend people who are literally being run over by this stuff, or if you start asserting these basic biblical teachings, which we can demonstrate psychologically, sociologically, and historically as well. So don't just quote the Bible on this. I've told people, if you're going to get involved in this kind of stuff, you're often going to get involved in two moral perspectives on an issue, and you got to prove your point. You've got to demonstrate that your perspective is better than the one that you're arguing against, even if it's the lesser of two evils. And that sometimes happens in a broken world. Like I said, we want better government because we're never going to have perfect government, but the worst thing we can have is really bad government. And we're trying to prevent that. So if you're going to assert these biblical truths because you know that they are actually good for all, they're barriers that are that are in our lives morally to curb our worst intentions, then if you're going to do this, expect criticism, expect challenges, but expect opportunity. And expect God's word to work. The secular Marxist view of government is going to challenge us. It's whether it's communism or critical race theory or identity politics, they're all kind of different versions of Marxism. They're all designed to actually put power back in federal government and to actually then execute their uniformitarianism or what we call equity. They're going to just do it by virtue of the power of government. Because there is no right and wrong. There's just who's in charge. I hear that all the time. Well, expect challenges from them because they want to be in charge. Expect challenges from the amoral market. There are people who think the market's going to solve all our problems. We've never said that. We'd rather have a free market because then, people have to decide whether they want to pay the price or the guy wants to decide whether he wants to sell it for that price. But what we don't want a command economy from some bureaucrat saying, here's the price. As I said, Nixon tried that when he said, I'm going to just determine what the price is going to be for commodities. And then suddenly there were no commodities because people couldn't live producing it or shipping it or whatever. So we don't want that. We don't want one person dictating what people can have either. That's the worst case scenario. But we don't believe the market will solve our problems either. We still got to be people who do with what we have from a moral, self-disciplined, religiously motivated perspective. That's where the solutions to our problems are going to come in. And then, proclaim the freedom to live godly, self-disciplined lives. That's kind of what it is. Now, again, proclaiming God's moral order is still not enough. We know that. We've talked about this before, but it's something we have to do. The best politics, the best economics, the best technology still can't save us and help us to be the human beings that God alone created and redeemed us to be. So that's why the church will always be something radically different than all of that. That's why God differentiates his work in the world. We call it two kingdoms on this program. We want you to understand what it means to be a two-kingdom citizen. You just know that God is at work, but he works two different ways in the world. One, to preserve the world, because all hell can break loose if he doesn't do that. And if all hell breaks loose, it's pretty tough to talk about how God saves the world because people are running for their lives. But God works in the world two different ways, to preserve the world and to save the world. He preserves the world through vocations. He preserves the world through good government, through good business. He preserves the world ultimately through families and family structures who take care of their children, raise children up in a moral, virtuous way of living, all those things. But that won't save us. That's how he preserves the world, even through non-believers and non-Christians, because all of us are sinful. He can still preserve the world through outward acts of moral dignity and service and virtue for others. But even that won't save us. That's the biblical message. And that's why God had to send his son to live our life, to die our death, and to give us his life as a gift. And that's why the church and the state are to be differentiated. But the differentiation of church and state, that's a Christian worldview, folks. So if you're one of these folks out there today who says, I believe in the separation of church and state, my first thing is, I didn't know you were a Christian. That's a Christian worldview. Because the differentiation of those two entities for the sake of your liberty flows from a Christian worldview. Other worldviews are not two kingdoms. They don't believe in church and state. They just either believe in church or state. One or the other. The idea of both, in tension, differentiated, that's the Christian worldview. So welcome to the Christian worldview. It's a beautiful thing. It actually protects your liberty, even if you're not a Christian. Isn't it neat? So that's where the church has a real role to play. We come with this voice that differentiates church and state. We come with this voice that actually puts politics in its proper place, even as it talks about hope and justice and peace as a gift from God, and a beautiful gift at that. That's who we are. And we can be a voice in the middle of this chaos. And I can tell you right now, when I see what the government is doing, when I see what Facebook is doing, when they see the harm that they know there's demonstrable harm that's happening to young girls from Instagram, I think is the one, and then Facebook is doing some things that are harming its constituents. But as long as they had to make a decision between what was best for Facebook, what was best for the consumer, and they always chose Facebook. So why are you putting your faith in technology? Why are you putting your faith in government? And when a government overnight can reclassify parents who love their kids as domestic terrorists, why are you putting your faith there? And why are you letting them do that to all of us as a people? So to me, politics teaches us what is desirable, what is lawful, what is the basement floor of civility that we have to have in our life. But if you start to talk about it guaranteeing outcomes, when you put that kind of power in the hands of sinners, there's going to be a brutal efficiency that always ends in tyranny. And we're fighting back against that so that all people can live lives of freedom, not freedom to do as you please, but freedom to do what is right for your neighbor in community. And then we've even got a greater message of the freedom that comes for what God has done for you. So keep those in tension, because it actually protects your liberty. And right now, as I said before, we're in the middle of some chaotic times. I called this Christians in the Chaos Part 2. And, we've got a role to play, and we also have a dignity to bring in the middle of this. And so my prayer for you today is that you see that dignity, you see that power that you have to be useful in God's hands, because he's the one who is preserving, and he is the one who's saving. Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Contained there are resources to empower your public square dynamic discipleship. Or check out our weekly Word from the Center opinion piece every Friday at facebook.com/LCRL Freedom. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Alert with Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.